Hello and welcome back to another episode of This Complex Life. Today, I have the privilege of being on the other side of the podcast, Mike. I've been interviewed by our guest, who I'll introduce you to in just a moment. And now the tables have turned, so I get to grill him a little bit. So welcome to the podcast, Simon.
Maria, happy to be grilled and really looking forward to it. It's been a little while since we had our chat, and it was so much fun on my show, and really looking forward to having some fun on your show too.
Awesome. So do you want to just let the listeners know a little bit about you and like what you do and who you are?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Simon. I'm a lived experience therapist as well. So I specialize in men's mental health, and I live up in the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, beautiful place of the world, with my wife and my little kids. We're on school holidays as we're recording today. So we're trying to juggle school holidays and working from home. Very challenging. But yeah, just really passionate around mental health, and particularly men's mental health, given my own story of lived experience for over 30 years with obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, anxiety, and I've also experienced burnout as well. So really excited to come on wherever I can to talk about those issues and try and prompt other guys to talk about it as well.
Amazing. And I really resonate with that conversation, encouraging people to talk. I guess most of my clients would be non-binary folk or female. So it's really great to have more men in this space, encouraging other men to find the support that's helpful for them.
Yeah, there's not many of us around, so it's nice to have a voice, but I'm finding little pockets of guys across Australia actually trying to promote men engaging with their mental health, which is really cool to see. But as we'll talk about a bit later on, for 3 decades, I haven't really seen a lot in this space for men. So it's nice to be, advocating for men to open up and share their stories.
And even to join the workforce. I think my degree, my undergrad or my master's of social work only had, I think it was like 90 females and like 8 men. So,
Yeah.
we need to have more people of a variety of backgrounds in the workforose to support.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember those days at uni, actually, and with the token guy in the class.
You were one of the 8 probably.
Yeah. But same in my career. Like before I was a social worker, I was in the public service, and that was, a female-dominated industry, even though at the executive level, and I'm not going to get into the gender equality stuff, but that was all male. But down at the grassroots where I was all female, and now I work a lot in the disability space, and there's a lot of females in that and not so many men. So yeah, we need to come out and get into these industries because they're really cool industries to work in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a bit of a chat. We were corresponding about what we would talk about, and we sort of decided to kind of look at depression, which is one of the leading mental illnesses in Australia. So anxiety and depression are our 2 most common. And we could have a bit of a chat about some of the gender differences and then kind of look at how partners or friends or family can be supportive or have different types of conversations. So maybe to get us started in your own observations, how does depression differ between men and women, or what do you notice in men in particular?
Yeah, I guess a lot of what I know comes from my own lived experience. So thinking back to when depression showed up in my life, it would have been probably as early as 13 or so. And I'm talking in the 90s here. And as I got older, it's become more profound and more of an impact on my life compared to back then. Back then, I didn't really know what depression was. I definitely didn't know what OCD or anxiety was either. And so I think thinking back to those days, the key words that come up for me is particularly for guys, is the suck it up, culture in Australia. And so depression is reflective of that. It's this notion that we can't talk about what's going on inside, and that compounds and compounds and compounds to the point when you're looking at, I guess, statistics from an Australian community's perspective, was it 7 out of 9 deaths by suicide per day are male. And what that tells me is that guys really do struggle to open up and talk about these things because the stats heavily weigh of, in guys, taking their life. And I also kind of couple that with family and domestic violence data, which indicates, depending on which literature you read, 75 to 90% of victims say that the perpetrator is male. And if a guy knew how to engage with his emotions and deal with things like anger and depression, sadness, anxiety, whatever it is, in a more healthy way, then I think some of those stats would come down. It wouldn't be so heavily weighted towards the male. But yeah, so certainly looking back, it's a cultural thing in Australia. It's a lot of the suck it up mantra, as we mentioned. And I guess it shows in different ways as well. Guys bottle it up and then they don't talk about it. When they get together with their mates, it's very superficial discussions. It's very much so, what's going on with the sport, or what's going on at work, or how's the missus going, or how the kid's going, but it doesn't really scratch much deeper than that. And so often guys actually do want to talk. It's just they don't know how to. They don't have those environments that they feel safe enough to talk, because if they do, they often feel like they're going to be laughed at, ridiculed. And I've had clients that come into my therapy clinic say that exact same thing. They've been to a therapist before, for example, for the first time, and were laughed at for how they felt or anything like that. And so what I value as a lived experience therapist is that individual journey that each of us take, and just recognizing however guys are hurting, and for whatever themes or issues that they're hurting about, it's all important. There's no benchmark of, if you meet this benchmark, then you're depressed and you're worthy of being depressed. It can be as small or as big as the individual believes it is.
Yeah, and it's a nice segue into the next thing I wanted to talk about, is how the symptoms differ. And I guess one of the things that when I've worked with parents and we're looking at emotional intelligence for teenagers, there's a really big difference between someone crying and someone getting angry. Yet both can be symptoms of something like depression. One of the criteria is an unusually sad or irritable mood. So both of them fit the criteria, but our responses are very different. How we treat someone who's sad versus irritable and maybe angry differs. So could you share a bit more light on how you see those symptoms manifest or more commonly seen in your male clients?
Absolutely. Anger is the one that comes to mind. And, whether it's family domestic violence, or it's just, they just feel angry with the world. Maybe they're having workplace issues or relationship issues. And anger is the culturally accepted way that guys know how to deal with this stuff. And I guess I come from a sporting background. So, I played Aussie rules growing up, and I know guys that are into boxing and into mixed martial arts and rugby and all that type of stuff. And the guys often would take out the anger on the pitch or in the ring or wherever they are. They throw their weight around as a way of asserting authority in the game, but sometimes it's also just to release the anger or the pent-up frustration that's inside. And so, but anger is like, it could be physical, it could be verbal as well. But sometimes, and actually not sometimes, in many cases, guys use other coping strategies to try and suppress the anger as well, because they know that anger is not something that is accepted in society, even though it's a valid emotion. So they use things like drugs and alcohol to suppress it. And that also suppresses the emotions or the thoughts or whatever that's underlying and causing the anger. And so that's a big one, is around how they're using drugs and alcohol, how they're responding to anger. But then you've got it's the same for females as well. It's the trouble sleeping or feeling tired all the time. That's certainly something that's showed up for me over my journey. It's just always feeling tired. And so when you're feeling tired all the time, you're cranky all the time. And so you have a very short fuse.
Yeah.
And sometimes, even as a lived experience therapist, and I still have, experiences today, is like, we just snap, and we know we just snapped, and we know that wasn't the right way to respond to a situation, but it just becomes automatic. And so often these things are an automatic response, and we don't think much about them. And then it's not until after the fact, maybe when something really bad has happened, maybe they've punched someone or punched a wall or had a car accident or whatever it is, and they go, oh yeah, that wasn't the best way to deal with that. But often it's just very automatic. But you talked a bit about that profound sadness as well. That feeling of lack of hope is one critical thing, and something I work with my guys on is, how can we find the hope inside? How can we reflect on our resilient factors, our strengths, but also set goals that are meaningful for the future, and goals that are based on values as well. So I work in that acceptance and commitment therapy space, where values underpin a lot of what we do. And I find that when the guys reconnect with values or they identify their values, they can start to live with greater purpose, and things just become a little bit easier. They've got this compass point now. Go, okay, this is why I'm getting triggered. or this is what's making me happy, and what can I do to get more of that as well. So I think anger is the biggest one, drugs and alcohol, but certainly the other symptoms and signs are very similar to females that I've worked with as well. But another one, key one that just comes to mind is loneliness.
Which I guess it might be worth just, running through that. So if people are listening and thinking, oh, well, what does that mean? So there's, an unusually sad or irritable mood that does not go away, and or a big difference in finding activities you used to find enjoyable not being enjoyable. So we know we need one of those two to meet the criteria. And then weight changes, so eating too much or too little, so big fluctuations there, trouble sleeping, too much or too little, that slow motor movement, fatigue, loss of energy, which you mentioned, feeling worthless, inappropriate guilt, reduced thinking capacity, and recurrent thoughts of death or dying. So I think you need at least 5 of those to sort of meet that criteria. So it's not just about being sad. It might be that it's irritability and then all of those other things, which I think some people kind of don't pick up on. They think, well, I've got nothing to be sad about, but it's not that simple.
I'm glad you brought up guilt there, because that's one of the key things. I guess one thing that guys do think about is guilt and shame that they're feeling that way in the first place. And I mentioned loneliness at the end there. It's even shame about feeling lonely. We grew up in, I guess, traditional villages. You think about the notion of it takes a village to raise a child. And, growing up in the 80s and a little bit in the 90s, it was still that notion of you kind of grow up and live where you grew up and you don't move. But then as technology changes, as transport, increases around the world, and makes it easier that we have more fluid, I guess, communities around the world. So many people that live where they aren't from that location. So I live on the Sunshine Coast. I'm not from the Sunshine Coast. I'm from Adelaide. My wife's from Hobart. We've lived in Canberra, Hobart, Brisbane, now the sunny coast. And
I'm sensing a bit of a theme there of closer to the sun.
Yes, definitely.
It's just slowly creeping up the island.
Definitely. But and every time we move, though, we have to recreate a community.
Yeah.
And even the guys that I work with, so a lot of guys do fly in, fly out. So they're not even living in the community that they sleep at for 2 weeks out of the month or whatever it is. And so there's this disconnect. And then there's this guilt that comes on. It's saying, well, why do I feel like this? Sometimes they don't even know why they're feeling like that. But if they do know why they're feeling like that, then that continues this negative thoughts that go around their heads. And then they just get stuck in this cycle until they either do something bad or they finally get help.
It makes me think, if anybody's listening and likes to kind of digest some books, the book Lost Connections is quite a really good one for conceptualizing depression. Have you read that one?
No, I am a very slow reader. So I've got a whole bunch of books here.
Oh my God, you can probably see mine, and they're the ones I haven't read.
And I guess I consume a lot of podcast stuff. So if it comes out in a podcast, I'll listen to it. Maybe I need to get an audio book or something like that. But I struggle with that. I struggle with attention because I just get caught up in the day-to-day hustle. Yeah. And this is also part of the issue: is day-to-day hustle takes over. And we forget how to kind of look after ourselves and fill our cups up with good stuff, like, books as well.
That book is excellent. So I really recommend it. And each chapter covers kind of a different thing, so you can listen to it in snippets. So thinking about the symptoms that you mentioned and some of the causes, like loneliness, it's a bit of it can lead to it, and it can also be a side effect, because if you think about low energy, you don't enjoy doing things, you might slowly start to withdraw, which increases the isolation. So our bodies are almost doing the opposite of what we need in that moment. How does depression impact relationships? Like, what are you starting to see in the folks that you work with about, with parents, partners, children? Like, what is I guess ramifications is a strong word, but what are the impacts? Like, what's happening day to day?
Yeah, it's huge at the moment. I guess we've got a lot of external pressures as well. That, at the moment, as we're recording, there's a lot of financial pressure across the board. It's housing pressure. It's finding money because mortgages are going up, or if you're renting, can't get out of that market. You can't get into the homeowners market and you're stuck in the rental. But what happens if your house gets sold as well? So there's a lot of these financial pressures which are just pressing down on an already existing issue of depression or mental illness more broadly as well. which I think reared its head from COVID. So COVID was actually I always say one of the good things about COVID was it gave us time to reflect on ourselves, but also it gave us permission to talk about mental health as a community as well. But now we've come out of it and we're suppressing it down again. And now we're thinking about things like finances, which put a lot of strain on the family relationships as well. You know, do I put food on the table? Or do I pay my credit card debt off? Or, you know, I work with one client who doesn't have enough money to put petrol in his car. So we're reverting to Zoom calls as opposed to seeing him in person, you know, and all these types of things. I think this one is a critical one at the moment. It's finances. But I guess if you strip that away and don't think about the external pressures and think just about the internal pressures as well, it's bickering with each other to start with. It's being snappy. It's being tired. It's, you know, not pulling your weight if you have like an equal household where everyone pitches in as well. I know, for example, when I'm feeling really rough, I stop doing things like housework. And that puts pressure on my wife because she likes a tidy house. And so that impacts her as well. And so then I feel bad because I'm not doing it, but also don't have the energy or the will or anything like that to do it. But then when I'm feeling good, yeah, I'll be up and doing my chores like everybody else, or even with the kids, it's getting snappy with kids very quickly. Or even with my son, when he's feeling a bit off as well, he's very short fused and things blow up, and then the daughter blows up and everyone kind of blows up, and sometimes you're just 5 minutes into a yelling argument and you're like, why is everybody yelling? And we don't really know. But then, you know, you talked a bit about withdrawal before, and this is, I guess, where alcohol comes in and drugs as well. Is we find ourselves maybe sitting on the couch on a Wednesday night having a few beers instead of just the weekend. And when you start using these things as coping mechanisms just to get through family life, let alone life in general as well. Or on the flip side of that is we use things like alcohol or drugs to re-engage as well. Kind of like this old Dutch courage concept. If we drink, then we've got the energy and the drive to actually communicate with somebody else. And that could be for a family barbecue, for example, just to show up and say, hey, I'm here, I'm present, but I'm using this as my comfort blanket just to be engaged.
Yeah.
But the long-term effects of it is, I guess, if you're not going into something like therapy or you're not taking meds and you're kind of hiding away from it, and I'm talking more to the guys that haven't ever engaged in a mental health conversation at this stage, is unless you do that type of stuff, it can ruin relationships. It can really put a pressing point on there. And again, that comes out into the family and domestic violence situation. It could end up in that space.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that relationship, like the bickering, and I guess, you know, for people listening, you're allowed to have conflict. That's fine. But when that's often and is irritability, what I hear you saying is the ripple effects of that is not just for partners, friends, children, but then there's health implications. So further choices around alcohol consumption, maybe other substances, lack of exercise. You know, if you're sitting on the couch drinking beer on a Wednesday night, you're probably not playing footy, soccer, Dungeons and Dragons. You're not connecting. So those patterns, that behavior, that it keeps kind of reinforcing the mood as well.
Yeah, and comfort eating is another one. Getting Maccas on the way home instead of cooking the meal.
Oh, that sounds delicious.
But when you're doing it every week,
yeah,
you know, and I guess it comes into that forms into habits as well. So we often opt for the easy option when we're struggling with something like depression, right? Because, oh yeah, it's easy just to get Maccas on the way home. I don't have to deal with it. I don't have to deal with the washing up afterwards, or you know, if I drink tonight, then I don't have to deal with awkward pauses in conversation where I'm expected to say something, because I can either just take a sip. Oh, Simon's having a drink, or Joe's having a drink, or Bob's having a drink, or you know, a smoke, or whatever they do. And that alleviates the distress of having to communicate, for example. So these things become habits, and what we want to do is create healthy habits, not so much of the negative habits. And healthy habits are, like you said, exercise. It's you know, seeing a therapist. It's engaging with friends as well. And we talked about loneliness. It's reconnecting with friends, or redefining friendship circles that lift you up and don't hold you down as well.
Yeah. The interesting thing you mentioned about therapy, there was some data that came out not too long ago saying that we know that more women than men seek support for mental health in general, but still about about 1 to 2 thirds of people who suffer from a mental illness, so diagnosable, don't seek support. And then out of the men who do, I think it's like half don't come back for their second session. So there's something in either as a field, we're not meeting people where they're at, but also maybe what expectations men have of what therapy is going to be like. And I know some don't do the feeling stuff, but therapy can still be, we need 1 to 3 sessions to kind of figure out what's going on. And then we can do pure behavior activation if that's what's helpful. So how can we encourage men to, how do we address that disparity in the help-seeking behavior, knowing that some of the stats are not in men's favor around mental health support? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it certainly makes sense. And it took me back to when I first went to therapy. And my first therapist was a psychologist. And I went in there and I felt it was okay to talk, but after a while, it became like homework. And so I had a bit of a break from therapy. Then a couple of years later, I went to another therapist, which also happened to be a psychologist. And it was exactly the same conversation that I had a couple of years earlier. And so I'm like, okay, I'm not feeling the connection here. Then I went to a psychiatrist, and it was that stereotypical older guy that I just did not connect with at all. And I just felt icky going into that session. And I went for once and I'm like, I'm never going back to that room again. I just hated that place. But then as I've progressed and got, I guess, more in tune with my mental health and understanding it a lot more, now I'm a bit more purposeful of who I go to see. So I'm very big now on reading up about a therapist before I see them, like what's on their website or their Facebook group about them. Are they going to be involved in conversations about the stuff I want to talk about? So that's really critical. Whenever I speak to someone, I say, interview your therapist or do some research on your therapist before you go in there. Because if you go in there, oh, there's a psychologist or they're a mental health social worker or counselor or whoever, and they're not interested in male depression, why are you in there?
That's such a good point. I was literally just updating my website or the Therapy Hub, my practice's website, to help people figure out what to do, because they'll say, oh, I need a clinical psychologist. And it's like, that clinical psychologist might specialize in eating disorders for 12-year-olds. That's not going to be helpful. And you might have a registered counselor who specializes in, I don't know, pregnancy. So it's really about the skills stop being as relevant after a few years of practical experience. So between clinical psychologist, psychiatrist, unless you need sort of complex medication, you're spot on in trying to find someone who either you gel with or who has experience with those presenting concerns or needs.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That's the starting point. And there'll be, probably by the time this is out, I've created like a journal, an e-journal that people can download to help them prepare for therapy. So to actually just have a think about, what do I want to get out of this after 6 or 10 sessions? If I was going to say, yeah, it's been helpful, what would that look like? Because I don't know about you, but you wouldn't go to a personal trainer and be like, I want to get fit, and then have one session and then nothing for 6 weeks and be like, I'm not fit yet. What's going on?
Yeah.
We need to adjust our expectations to what's actually possible in the treatment.
Absolutely. And it comes from trial and error. Like, I didn't know how to do all this without actually going into these different therapists and realizing, okay, these are not the right fits for me. And I think it also adds on there, it's knowing, or researching your therapist before, having some sort of expectations of what therapy is. And the perfect examples are to listen to podcasts, for example, by therapists, because you can hear them talking about, what different therapy, modalities are. But it's also around male-centric supports and supports that get male culture. And I come to this because when I started my journey, and that was 11 years ago that I went to that GP and got my first mental health treatment plan, which used to be a mental health care plan, is the supports weren't for men. They were female-centric or they were children-centric. And the ones that were male-centric were family and domestic violence or alcohol and drugs. And so that puts a shame and stigma on the guys already, because they're like, well, I'm not either of those. Or maybe they are, but they're not identifying as. And I don't want to go in there and feel berated because I'm a guy dealing with anger issues with my partner. They want someone who gets what it's like to live with depression. and can, because I've got clients that say to me, Simon, do you know what depression is? And have you ever experienced it? I'm like, hell yeah, and we talk about it, and we talk about it in a non-judgmental way, in an open way, in a way that adds value to the session. It's not about me, it's about how can I just share a little bit of insight into my journey, such as, for example, finding the right therapist for me. And I'll say to this, guys, if I'm not the right fit for you, that's okay. Like, don't let this stop you, because there are millions of other fits for you. We're not going to get it on the first go. And so, yeah. And so it's about providing that male centric support. And this is where I love being a lived experience therapist. And I recommend anyone who's thinking about getting into a therapy role, but they're holding themselves back because they've got lived experiences, to do it, because you have such a deeper connection with your clients if you can say, yeah, I've been in those shoes.
I mean, the lived experience bit is interesting, because if the statistics, the lifetime prevalence for mental illness is about 1 in 2. Some data even suggests as high as 80 or 90%. So you're almost guaranteed that every second therapist you see will have had a lived experience. But for a number of reasons, people don't feel comfortable necessarily promoting that, or are taught that too much self-disclosure isn't helpful. So you can ask for people, I guess it's interviewing the therapist and kind of getting a sense of what they're like. I even thought, like, I've had some people who want to have therapy. We do it in a park, or we like, I don't know if you remember that old episode of Friends where I think they're just throwing a ball around for like hours. I've done that. I've spent a whole session like throwing a hacky sack with someone just because sitting and staring was too uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got 90% of my clients don't come to my clinic. In fact, I've stopped renting my clinic so much, because I just rent it as a casual basis for that very reason. And I play basketball with one guy. I play video games with another guy. There's one guy, we walk his dog, or we go and buy him a pack of smokes. And as we're doing these things, we're doing our therapy in the car, or as we walk along, or, we've got beautiful beaches up here on the sunny coast. And I'd spend 3 sessions of a week walking and talking on the beach with people. And it's that connection with the outside world. Because I hate sitting as a therapist. I hate sitting in a clinic all day, and I rather be outside and enjoying the beautiful weather. But also, it's the gentle exercise, which might be the first time these guys have walked anywhere for the last week. And it's also, I look at it as also connecting with community. It's the subtle, how you're going, or a nod or a smile at the person passing them by. And this counteracts that concept of loneliness we were talking about earlier, because we're connecting in a very broad way, or a vague way, with community by being out in community as well. And so most of my clients, that's what we do. We do therapy a little bit differently to the traditional ones. And again, there's not many of us doing this kind of stuff, because as therapists, we feel, I've got to have a clinic, I've got to do 6 a day, I've got to do this and that. Well, we don't. We can actually be a bit more flexible.
Yeah, I think it's really tricky, because I think some of it's the therapist's ideas, and sometimes it's client-led. So sometimes if no one asks us, we never think that that's something people want. So yeah, definitely, I've done a lot of that. And basketball, shooting hoops, like, it's still therapy. You're just, instead of playing with your fingers or ripping up a piece of paper, you're doing something else. The last thing I kind of wanted to talk about before we wrapped up, like, we've covered so much, is how can couples support each other or navigate this. So a lot of podcast listeners are female, and probably a lot of the data for this podcast has shown that is probably about 70% female listeners as well. So if someone is listening to this and they're like, I think this relates to my partner, instead of just like sending it to them randomly, what are things people can do if they're listening? They're like, this would be really good for a client, or for a friend or family member. How can either couples navigate and support each other, or how do we what's the next step here?
Yeah, this is one of the most commonly asked questions. I often get calls from a distressed partner, or maybe in the NDIS space, a support coordinator, or a friend, or someone who's like, I've got this guy in my life and nothing's sinking in, nothing's getting in. For one thing, it's like, we also want to do therapy differently. We don't want to go to a clinical space. And so that's a beauty of my service, is I spend most of my time outside, which is fantastic. But I often say to people who ring me, it's like, well, you can't lead the horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So it has to be a recognition in the guy himself. And this could be a child as well, or someone who's elderly, the whole spectrum of males out there. is they have to be kind of willing to start talking about stuff. And that encouragement starts in the house, for example. So I'll give you a quick snapshot of some of the relationships I've been in over the years. Is, growing up in high school, at the end of high school, university, all those years, I had a couple of serious relationships, and I was still undiagnosed at this stage. So living with the depression, the OCD, the anxiety in particular. And it felt like they were always saying, Simon, you can be such a dick or whatever, and we want you to go get help, or you need to go and sort this stuff out. And I always felt like I was the problem, and that I was trying to be put into their box of what an ideal partner should look like. Simon, you need to talk more. Simon, you need to drink less. All this stuff. And I just felt like, yeah, I was the problem. Fast forward until I met my now wife, and she was the opposite. She never really wanted to put me into a box or paint me as this person who's different, or try and mold me into this amazingly sociable person, even though I do, which might sound weird because I do podcasts all the time and I'm a very sociable person, but I'm a very much of an introvert as well. And so I like my quiet time. I just like being quiet sometimes. Sometimes that's a depression, but sometimes that's just me, who I am as my makeup. So trying to force me to be this overly bubbly person in every single social situation doesn't happen, and I get very awkward. So my wife was the first person to just kind of accept me for being a little bit quieter, or accept me that she doesn't want to mold me into this person who's this ideal partner. She just wants me to be the best version of myself. But once I started connecting with that kind of vibe from my now wife, we weren't married at the time, and she's the one who said, Simon, you're doing all this stuff. You're no longer that person I met. I worry for you. I want you to get help. And that kind of nurturing, and that took a long time. It took me years to get to that stage. That nurturing was what I reflected inwards and go, you know what? Now's the time. I'm ready now to talk. And she's right. But also it didn't feel like I was getting pushed into this. And so then I made the phone call and I drove myself to the doctor. So for some people, they need help to go and do that as well, which is fine. But that was a catalyst. It was having that loving relationship that just saw me for me and was okay with me doing things in my own timeline as well. And then since then, she's been a catalyst for me starting mindfulness, the therapy business, for example. And we've been, we've got two lovely kids now, and she supports me so much because I am the head case in the family, and I openly share that. I'm okay with that. But without her support and just willingness to just let me be me, that I wouldn't have never gone to therapy if I felt like I was just getting put into another box. And so partners can do that for each other. They can see each other for just who they are as human beings. Don't push it, because if you push it, it's not going to happen, particularly for guys. But also, I guess, changing the environments as well, just subtle changes. You can change different ways that you eat differently, or you consume different stuff, recommending different podcasts or books or different TV shows that don't keep facilitating the same discussions or anything like that. Just little things like that. But I think a lot of it goes to just how supportive you are as a partner. It's a really hard question to answer, but that's the support I had. It was what led me to go and see that GP for the first time.
Yeah, no, I think it is a hard one. And it's one of the things that when I run mental health first aid, it's one of those times where often workplaces will get their teams to do it, or, schools will get a whole bunch of teachers, but then practicing having a bit of a framework, people then say, oh, I've actually, because I usually run them a week apart, I use this at home with someone. And it's really about sort of noticing the signs and symptoms and saying, hey, I can see that you're not enjoying this activity as much as you used to. You do seem cranky and irritable. I wonder if it could be that your mental health isn't great, or you don't seem quite like yourself. And it's being clear and direct, but with empathy and care. And there's a subtle difference then in saying, I wonder if now's a good time to maybe see your GP, or I know that you've had trouble in the past, but things feel like they're getting, out of control again. It's having a bit of a framework. So if people need those skills, I recommend looking at the Mental Health First Aid Australia website. I think Are You OK Day has like little videos and scripts, but avoiding it's probably not a great thing.
We talked a bit about earlier around interviewing a therapist, and I found this also applies to GPs. So, for example, just quickly, I have a GP who specializes in men's mental health, and he's my go-to every time. But for a while, he wasn't at the clinic. And I just relied on the person on the reception to say, oh, yeah, this person's okay. I walked in, I said, I want a med review. I want to check my medications are right. And his response was, well, what medication do you want to go on? And then, so what I found was I said, okay, you're not the right fit here. I don't think you really get what's going on. I actually want to refer to a psychiatrist because I know they deal with meds. And so I did that. And then when I reflected back, I checked the website of my GP clinic, and that particular doctor didn't specialize in men's mental health. I think he was just a guy who had the next availability. So it's the same thing. It goes for your GP, and they all have their websites and about me things. Read them and find the one, oh, men's mental health. This guy might actually get what I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a bit of resilient help seeking. GPs are general practitioners, so you might need to be okay with trying a few different ones and then finding the right fit, because it's not as simple and straightforward.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's the same with all the modalities of therapy as well. Like we're seeing a lot of, like I do a lot of mindfulness stuff, but there's people that do equine therapy or animal assisted therapy, just straight out cognitive behavioral therapy. There's a whole, breath work. I'm finding some amazing results from my own personal journey through breath work at the moment. Men's yoga, like there's all these things you can do that aren't traditional therapy, and you don't always have to take meds as well. It's just about being open to the possibilities and the breadth of services that are out there, and doing a bit of research and I guess trial and error, just trying things out and seeing how they go as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Simon. I appreciate your insights, and hopefully folk learn something from this. If people want to connect with you or find you, where do you frequent?
Yeah,
apart from strolling the beach,
all the places.
Yeah, strolling the beaches of the Sunshine Coast.
You will find me on the beaches of the Sunshine Coast. Look out for my black t-shirt with my white logo on it. But the website's the easiest because that links to all my social media and stuff. So it's www.mindful-men.com.au. And yeah, that links to all my socials. I've got the Mindful Men podcast as well, which you've been a guest on, and I had an amazing chat with you. So come and check that episode out. It was a great chat around emotions and all the stuff around social work, which I love talking about as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To keep the conversation going, head on over to Instagram or LinkedIn and follow me. If you'd like to keep updated with episodes and other interesting things happening in mental health, join my weekly This Complex Life newsletter, where I'll share tools, tips and insight. There's a link in the show notes. Got a question you want answered? Shoot me an email or a DM. I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy the show, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a rating and a review. It helps other people find the podcast.